second time's a charm, maybe. We'll see. Janelle, if you could, I'll unmute you right now. Oh, you are unmuted.
Hey, I just did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I'm going to say next when it's time to change the slides, if that's okay.
That's okay with me.
Great. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to present today on a new incentive program for single-family dwellings for earthquakes. Next slide, please. The California Earthquake Authority has an incentive program called Earthquake Brace and Bolt. And in order for you to understand where this program came from, I just want to give you a couple slides about who the California Earthquake Authority, or CEA, is. Next slide. So the next slide is, pardon me, the CEA is an unusual instrumentality of the state. We're not an agency. We're publicly managed. Our governing board includes the governor, insurance commissioner, state treasurer. Click, please. You can click a couple times here. This was animated. Two more times. The CEA is privately financed, though, so we're not part of the state budget. So the money that is collected from premiums is put aside in its own account, invested conservatively for policyholders in case they need a claim. And money came from original participating insurers. You may see a logo of one of your insurers who's one of our participating insurers, and then from the premiums of policyholders. Next click, please. But it has a public mission. With our public board and our public mission, the idea is to promote education, mitigation, and insurance to make California more resilient for earthquakes. Next slide, please. So we fund our Earthquake Brace Bolt program out of something called the Loss Mitigation Fund. It was required by the California Insurance Code when the CEA was created after the Northridge earthquake. It's funded by up to 5% of investment income annually. And the idea is it's not just for policyholders, but rather it's intended for all Californians. Next slide, please. We operate the Earthquake Brace Bolt program through a different entity that's jointly managed by the CEA and the California Office of Emergency Services. That's the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. It's the state's FEMA. And it has a separate board with 2 members from each of those organizations. Next slide. The first incentive program, Earthquake Brace and Bolt, of that CRMP program is to do just some very simple things, which is sill plate anchorage and cripple wall bracing. We provide up to $3,000 to qualifying homeowners on a retrofit that's typically statewide between $5,000 to $8,000. Next slide. EBB funding comes from that CEA Loss Mitigation Fund, plus, if you click a couple times here, $3 million from the California state budget for 2016 and 2017. Plus, we are managing a FEMA grant program in Napa following the earthquake that is $300,000. So that's 100 homes in Napa that are going to be retrofit through this program. Next slide, please. The CEA's Brace and Bolt program is kind of a supplement to that Earthquake Brace Bolt, which is just for policyholders, but I want to make sure we don't get these two confused. So that the Brace and Bolt is for Californians in particular zip codes with particular kinds of houses, but we're adding a Brace and Bolt program for policyholders as well. And not only do they get the up to $3,000, but they can qualify for a significant up to 20% hazard mitigation discount. Next slide, please. So I wanted to quickly just talk about Southern California's earthquake hazard, because I know when I talk to people, one of the things I hear a lot, if you could click on the next slide, please, is that, well, we went through the, and then blank, insert the earthquake that was nearest to you. And this is something that you might be able to Google and find, Southern California earthquake hazard. It's important to realize that earthquakes are actually rather local. You know, the great big giant magnitude 8s and 9s can cover hundreds of miles. But for these less than 7 magnitude earthquakes, they really are local. And so you may have felt it, but it was not necessarily the earthquake that will challenge your property, your house. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that, you know, if you do have one of these large earthquakes that's right in our backyard, we could see extreme to violent ground shaking that stretches out for hundreds of miles. This is a scenario that was created for the San Andreas fault. And you can see here that when you look at this and you kind of identify where Pasadena and the eastern part of the Los Angeles County are, that's where we went to with our earthquake brace program for very good reason. Next slide, please. So what kind of house are we looking to brace and bolt with this program? Next slide, please. It's this house, and you're talking about the beautiful historic homes that you all are so interested in. These are examples of beautiful homes that were damaged in the 2014 Napa earthquake. The house on the upper right actually came down off of its foundation the day after the earthquake. House to the right of it had been retrofitted, but was red tagged because of its neighbor. It's very, very disruptive. All of these people had to move out for more than a year. In fact, that yellow house in the top left was still not occupied 2.5 years later. It is tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars just to shore this house back up again and put a new foundation under. All the while, as I said, living outside of that home, trying to get kids to school, and still paying that mortgage. Next slide, please. So houses that don't have appropriate anchorage and appropriate cripple wall bracing do this. They either slide off of the foundation because of lack of bolts, or they can topple off of the foundation because the short walls that surround the crawl space don't have adequacy to keep that house over its foundation. And it can be very dangerous as well. Next slide, please. Also, historic homes typically have masonry chimneys. Masonry chimneys are like the litmus paper of earthquakes. They're the first thing that's damaged in an earthquake. And so these are important things. And just strapping them to the house is not appropriate. They really need to be either rebuilt or addressed by a structural engineer. Next slide, please. Seismic retrofit. Appropriate bolting is done either with a rotohammer, where you drill down through a block or the sill plate and put in a new bolt, or when you have a short cripple wall or no cripple wall around your crawl space, you might use a foundation plate. And these particular plates are available at Home Depot, very easy to get, and they take the place of anchor bolts. Next slide, please. To brace and bolt a house, first and foremost, you need to have an appropriate concrete foundation. And so this is one of the problems with these beautiful older homes, is if they have unreinforced masonry or stone or just rubble foundations, there's really nothing to put a bolt into. In order to use that, like leave that particular foundation in place, you would have to have a structural engineer come in and assist you. They can, in fact, do things. But if you want to have a contractor do it without an engineer, there are in fact standard plans for classic concrete T-shaped footings that can be done with a contractor or do-it-yourselfer without an engineer design. Obviously, if you have a historic home and you want to preserve that beautiful looking foundation, then you would need to get an engineer to design an interior concrete foundation that you can attach to. Next slide, please. And there was my, that doesn't work. So there's that cripple wall, that short stud wall that goes around your crawl space. And what we're doing in order to stiffen that, to keep that house over its foundation, is we're going in and we're putting in plywood or OSB bracing. OSB is that kind of looks like plywood. You see it a lot with newer homes nowadays. Next slide, please. So earthquake brace bolt, next slide. Earthquake brace bolt, the qualifying house is pre-1979. Very important that you can find a house that's not properly anchored or braced in a pre-1979 house. You really find them in pre-1940. There were no seismic codes before 1940, and as they started to come in, they were sporadic up until 1979. After the 1971 Simi Valley, they were much more consistent. 5 or 6 steps up to that first floor means that you likely have a crawl space with cripple walls. And as I said, an older home likely means that you had inadequate bolting, maybe even no bolts, and certainly not appropriate bracing around that crawl space. Next slide, please. So earthquake brace and bolt is easy to find, earthquakebracebolt.com. Our website has great information for homeowners, contractors, and building officials. And next slide. And we have a contractor directory so that you can search with your zip code and get within, and you can insert whichever miles radius you want. We've got over 600 contractors statewide in our directory. Next slide. What we require is a permit. Very important that the permit states that the scope of work is in accordance with what we require, and it's very clear in our registration that we require a code, Chapter A3, that's been adopted into the state building code, and it needs to be signed by your local building official. Next slide, please. The Brace and Bolt project, in terms of historic homes that do have concrete foundations, the work is all done under the house, and so typically you don't have a problem with CEQA or with historic preservation issues. Obviously, you would need to check that, but the work is all done underneath the house. Next slide. In addition to that, water heater bracing is required. If you have a new water heater, a new home, you're supposed to have water heater bracing. What we're doing with this is we're encouraging people to have the contractor take a look, see that it's been done properly, or if you're a do-it-yourselfer, to make sure that you check the guidelines and that your water heater has been properly braced. The submittals: invoice from the contractor, a W-9. Unfortunately, we've got tax exemption at the state level. We're working on the federal level, but don't have it yet. And then that signed permit. Next slide, please. So financial protection, just finally, next slide. The retrofitted house is not earthquake proof. It will suffer damage, and it may have more than one vulnerability. It may need more than just bolts and bracing. I think we've only got 2 more slides. Next slide. For example, you may have the living space over garage, which means that you might have inherent problem at that garage door. Whenever you take a wall out of a house, essentially you've taken out the element that resists earthquakes. Hillside conditions require a structural engineer, and then, as I mentioned, those large masonry chimneys. Next slide. And then financial protection. There is a calculator on the CEA's website. We have choices now on deductibles from 5 to 25%. And as I said, we do have up to 20% discount on earthquake insurance if you do the hazard reduction discount. You don't have to you're not going to be called by anyone if you put information into this premium calculator, but it gives you a chance to look at financial protection in addition to retrofitting a home. Next slide. So CEA hazard reduction discount is that brace and bolt will done properly and verified with this form will get you up to 20% discount on earthquake insurance. But most important, that brace and bolt is essential to keep that house, particularly the historic homes that you've worked so hard on preserving, over their foundation, and so that your house is much more readily available to shelter in place and to preserve the historic fabric of this beautiful state that we live in. And I believe that if that's not my last slide, the next one is. And if you need information on earthquake brace bolt, it's very easy to find earthquake brace bolt. The program for 2017 is available in many cities around Pasadena, in Altadena, Pasadena, West Pasadena, San Marino, lots of Los Angeles. It's based on zip code. Take a look, see if your zip code's in it. Go in, look at the video, look at the animations, and there's lots of people available on the other side of the customer care phone to assist you if you have any questions. But now I'll stop and see if you have any questions for me.
Okay, and Janelle, what I'll do, you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
You'll repeat them for me?
I will repeat the questions. So any questions? Yes. How is historic defined in this program?
Okay, so we actually don't define historic. I wanted to mention historic because I know that obviously by you all being involved today, you're related to the historic preservation in some way. Our only criteria is that your house is pre-1979 and that it in fact has the bolt and brace vulnerability and that you utilize a permit. So we have absolutely no restrictions in terms of historic.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Yes. So if a house is not in any of the zip codes that you identified, do you have any other resources that you can point us to?
You know, other than your bank, the California State Treasury actually has implemented a loan program for single-family dwellings, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's brand new and just rolling out. I think if you were to Google California State Treasury's Office seismic loans, you'll find it. But at this point, there are no other grant programs that I'm aware of. So it would be up to you to get a loan. We will be expanding, pending continuing support from the state of California.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, I'm now going to turn it